At the height of the British Empire, the world's most powerful financial city wasn't London. It was a rough, chaotic port across the Atlantic that didn't even exist a century earlier. London had the Bank of England, centuries of accumulated capital, and a navy that protected trade routes spanning every ocean. Yet by the early 20th century, a former Dutch trading post on the island of Manhattan had quietly become the center of global finance. How did a city with no empire, no royal navy, and no centuries-old banking houses overtake the financial capital of the British Empire itself? The answer lies not in boardrooms or banking charters, but in a ditch dug through the wilderness of upstate New York. In 1825, the Erie Canal opened, transforming New York City from a coastal port into the main gateway between the American interior and the Atlantic world. Before the canal, moving goods from the Midwest to the coast was prohibitively expensive, requiring weeks of wagon travel over rough terrain. The canal connected the Great Lakes to the Hudson River, creating a continuous water route from the farms of Ohio to the docks of Manhattan. Suddenly, grain, timber, and raw materials from the American interior flowed directly into New York's harbor with ease and speed. Transport costs for goods dropped by as much as 90%. What had been uneconomic became essential. Farmers and producers in the Midwest now had a choice: send their goods down the Mississippi to New Orleans, or east through the Erie Canal to New York. They chose New York because it was cheaper, faster, and more reliable. The flow of goods began to shift. More goods meant more ships arriving in New York Harbor. More ships meant more insurance contracts written in New York offices. More cargo meant more credit extended to finance it. More transactions meant more merchants who needed banking services. Banks, brokers, and traders clustered around the port because that was where the business was happening. Insurance companies formed to underwrite the growing fleet. Commodity exchanges emerged to trade the grain and cotton passing through. Financial markets developed to manage the flow of capital and the risk inherent in moving goods across oceans. New York didn't become powerful because it had banks. It got banks because it controlled the flow of goods. This is the mechanism that the outline captures, but deserves deeper attention. Trade volume creates financial density. Every bushel of grain that passed through New York required a bill of lading, a letter of credit, an insurance policy. Every one of those documents was a financial transaction that employed someone, generated fees, and built expertise. Over time, the city that handles the goods becomes the city that handles the money from the goods. And the city that handles the money becomes the city that attracts the capital looking for investment. As American industrial output grew through the 19th century, New York became the primary entry and exit point for capital. European investors looking to finance American railroads, factories, and infrastructure did so through New York markets. British capital flowed through New York banks into American railroads. German capital financed American industry through New York brokers. The city that had once been a colonial outpost was now the intermediary between the Old World's capital and the New World's expansion. London still had more wealth, but New York had the growth. And in finance, growth attracts capital as reliably as capital seeks growth. Then came World War I. Europe plunged into conflict, and the flow of capital reversed. European nations sold their American assets to finance the war. The United States shifted from debtor to creditor almost overnight. New York markets handled the transactions. New York banks managed the flows. New York became the place where the world's money moved. By the time the war ended, the center of global finance had shifted across the Atlantic. London still mattered. Still matters today. But it was no longer the undisputed capital of the world's financial system. The historical irony is profound. London built the world's largest empire through trade and finance, only to be overtaken by a city that used the same logic, but without an empire at all. New York never needed a royal navy because it didn't need to protect trade routes. Only needed to be the best place to land. It never needed centuries of banking tradition because it built new banks faster than London could expand its old ones. It never needed an empire because the goods came to it willingly, drawn by the simple logic of cost and efficiency. This pattern repeats in our own time, though the flows have changed. Today, financial centers rise, not just from political power, but from control over flows data, capital, logistics, Digital infrastructure, a city that becomes the hub for data transmission, where fiber optic cables converge and servers cluster, attracts the financial services that depend on that data. A region that controls the logistics networks of global trade, the ports and rail lines and warehouses, becomes the place where capital accumulates. Singapore handles a disproportionate share of global trade finance, not because it has an empire, but because ships pass through the Straits of Malacca. Hong Kong became a financial giant because it was the gateway between China's manufacturing economy and global capital markets. Cities that dominate networks become financial capitals, even without traditional political authority. The mechanism is the same. Control the flow, and the money follows. This is why Silicon Valley, despite having no traditional banking heritage, has become a center of financial innovation. The flow of data and the concentration of technology talent created conditions where new forms of finance could emerge. It is why Dubai, a city built on sand, now hosts the financial flows of the Middle East and South Asia. Whoever controls the routes of goods, money, or information eventually controls the systems built around them. Power follows movement. This is a truth as old as trade itself. The empires that controlled the Silk Road controlled the exchange of goods and ideas between East and West. The cities that controlled Mediterranean trade in the Middle Ages Venice, Genoa became banking centers before banks existed. The nations that controlled Atlantic trade in the Age of Sail, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, Britain rose to global dominance in turn, and the city that controlled the gateway to the American continent's vast interior became the financial capital of the 20th century. New York didn't defeat London with armies. It didn't conquer territory or impose its will through force. It simply became the place where everything had to pass through. The grain from Ohio, the timber from Michigan, the capital from Europe. The immigrants from every chorale of it flowed through New York, and in the handling of those flows, in the financing of those movements, in the insurance and credit and exchange that made them possible, New York built the financial architecture of the modern world. The lesson is simple but often overlooked. Finance is not primary. It is secondary to the flows it serves. Banks follow trade. Capital follows goods. Financial centers emerge where the world's business actually happens. This is why the next financial capital may not look like the last one. It may not be in New York or London. It may be in a city that currently seems peripheral, a place that controls some flow we have not yet learned to value. Data flows are creating new centers. Logistics networks are concentrating capital in unexpected places. The cities that dominate the green energy transition, that control the mining and processing of lithium and rare earths, may become the financial centers of the late 21st century. Power follows movement, and movement is always shifting to new routes, new channels, new systems. The empires that try to control the old flows too tightly often find themselves bypassed entirely, just as the Erie Canal bypassed every other port on the Atlantic coast. New York won because it made itself the most efficient gateway. It lowered costs, increased speed, and let the goods choose their own path. That is the quiet logic of power in a connected world. You don't need to control the goods, you only need to make yourself the best place for them to pass through. And if you do that well enough, the money will follow. The banks will come. The financial system will build itself around your docks, your warehouses, your fiber optic cables. Because in the end, finance is just the shadow cast by the movement of real things. And the city that controls the movement controls the shadow. New York proved that an empire is not required to build a financial capital. You only need to be the place where everything has to pass through. If you want to understand the forces that will shape the financial capitals of tomorrow, the flows of data, energy, and goods that will determine where power concentrates next, then hit subscribe, because the next New York is being built right now, somewhere most people aren't watching.